So the intent of our three code seminars, just to kind of recap, was to start with the IEBC as a starting point to determining whether or not, if, especially if you have an existing building, how does one approach the codes? And with that, the building codes, which of course we all know and love, the IBC with the Minnesota version of that in 1305. We spoke about that last week. And this one kind of really drills down into the accessibility portion that each of those other two codes cross references to. So that's how I was trying to approach this, going from the most general to the most specific. So this, again, as I reiterated earlier, was a presentation that Karen had put together. Uh, I have done this with another colleague, Karen Johnson. Kudos to her, although she is retired now, so good for her. She and I have been giving these presentations in-house. So there are some notes here that I've built on from those conversations we've had with our various staff within HGA. So you can see obviously the notes that are here from the presentation. Of course, you will be getting these, so you'll always have this as a cross-reference uh, moving forward here. So basically the accessibility code and all the provisions that go with it. Just to kind of a recap that Karen had given, and I made some additional notes on this, how the accessibility code works. You can't read that one part very well to the left, but trust me, it is basically just giving a summary of where all the different parts are fitting within the tree. What is interesting to note is on the right side, obviously we have the various scoping documents. So you start with 2018, the IBC Chapter 11. This is taking that information verbatim, but then amending it. So what you will see then in 1341, you will not look, you will everything gets cross-referenced or taken right out of the 2018 code and sends you here from Chapter 11. So the ANSI A11719, the technical part of it, that's what we're actually going to be addressing here. The book that's probably doesn't show it there, but that's what it looks like. This is the 2020 version of that, and that incorporates both the ANSI 117.1 and then the amendments to go with it, which are addressed on the second part, the other side of the equation here. And then the IEBC basically sends you to the 1341, and that's based on section 305. So there was just some additional notes that Karen was suggesting, but here again, 305 on the IEBC sends you basically to here. So that's really what that note's about. The thing that I wanted to just point out here again, just to emphasize, and because this gets confusing, there are various versions of the A117 that are occurring throughout. It has its cycles as well. And you can imagine we haven't had very many of these, but this 2009 has been the cornerstone to how we address the ADA in Minnesota. There is a 2017 edition, but that was not adopted. Even though it's out there, it was not adopted. So you still look at the 2009. And as far as I know, no amendments have been made to that document, which is, I believe, what Karen was getting to here, is that you're cross-referencing it, but there is no amendments to that document. On the other hand, Minnesota, of course, has made its own amendments because that's what we do here. We like to amend where it's specific to our jurisdiction, if you will. And I'll get into the details of what some of those things are. So I just made a couple of notes. You can see it's the 2020 accessibility code. I showed you a cover of that. and how that plays out. So it is now, it wasn't then once you gave this presentation, but as most of you know, the codes, most of the code chapters have been effective as of March 31st, 2020. And obviously I have a copy of several of the codes, uh, this being one of them, and they're available either online or you can of course purchase them. And so we're going to get into the basics here, the building blocks of it. So these are critical. And I know Karen and I have had numerous chats about these and other things in the past. Uh, just one thing I'd want to know here, if most of you are probably very well aware of these. If you're going into the next cycle, the one that did not get adopted, 2017 version, uh, there are going to be additional provisions. And whether it's in that cycle or the one after it that is being considered, and I believe it is this one, the sizes get larger. And it has more to do with uh, uh, the larger wheelchairs that are utilized, and as well the electrical wheelchairs. So there are some provisions that are coming in the future, but right now we're not needing to address them. These are the go-tos. These are the ones you should be looking at. And that's been that way for quite some time, ever since I've been involved with Kurt Wheely and the 1341 as we know it here in Minnesota. Just more things to recall. 48 max depending on your reach level. The one thing that Karen and I just touched base on is more of a clarification to what's already been stated here. You're going to get the same result, 25-inch dimension for as far as FHA is concerned, where they're measuring the countertop itself, where the building code ADA are referring to the cabinet of 24 inches. The bottom line is that you're in the end, you're probably going to be talking about 25 inches. But in either case, these provisions, the forward reach and the side reach apply. And so you've seen that marked up. And ask of, can it be operated with a closed fist? I think there's a phrase out there that's been utilized, which is basically, it shall not require tight grasping, pinching, or twisting of the wrist. Those are all still applicable. Just keep that in mind, obviously, as you're going through your codes and your hardware groups, make sure that those provisions are still in play. So accessible routes and entrances, there are some changes here. Some of these, the general scoping, the 1 to 20, indoor ramps, curb ramps, elevators, and platform lifts. We won't get into all the details, but those provisions are still applicable. One thing that I wanted to make a emphasize is Minnesota unique amendment to not include exterior ramps as an option. So know that is, and it has more to do with our weather than anything else, but it's something that the Accessibility Council is really, was very instrumental in making sure that items that are going to be more difficult for someone in a wheelchair uh, can be applying within Minnesota winters as they are. So the components, obviously we're going to have things like gazebos and bleacher seating that need to be addressed. And you can't, talking about the 1 to 12 slope, because that gets challenging to do something that 1 to 20, but there are provisions in the code to address that. And the accessible route, this is something that actually we did talk, I shared this presentation that I was getting, or the amended presentation with Karen a few days ago, and she had reiterated that this is an important feature. must meet code to maximum extent feasible to provide accommodation, meaning especially with existing conditions where you have the IEBC and you're brought to this code, not all times are you going to find it possible to get the ramping to meet the provisions of the code. So there is some latitude to it, and this is one of them. So just note that it isn't all is not lost if you've got existing conditions and you're doing whatever you can to achieve those runs and those ramp runs. There are provisions in the code that give you a little bit of wiggle room. So really talking about the provisions that are already in the code. None of this has changed. Curved ramps, obviously you have conditions where you're dealing with exterior conditions and you're trying to meet the slopes that are required to go from an accessible parking space to the public entrance, or to the main entrance rather. And you can see the provisions where we're talking about the 60% for your entrances need to be accessible and what that could mean. And there's some good examples here of that. One thing that Karen had alluded to just point out to our teams, you can't have things that are, like furniture in the way of your clearances, your door clearances. And that might seem obvious, but it's not necessarily always going to be applied. And some of this is beyond our control. Obviously, if it's furniture, something that can be placed after the fact, after the space has been designed. But it's something that a fire marshal could certainly flag, and for that very reason. So those are the kinds of things to be cognizant of it. Keep that in mind. And then there's a chart that's already in the code, and this is really just talking about the clearances that are necessary without anything else, any other obstructions involved. Now, there are other things like at doorways where we may be coming up to that here, but when it comes to an accessible route, this is a good chart to actually give you those parameters so they're clear to understand. So this one really talks about, these two slides are really about employee work areas as opposed to public work areas. So obviously on the right side is the public. It's going to be a higher level of accessibility requirements than if you were like going into a cooler that was only for the employees. So you're going to need to be able to address both conditions, but know that obviously the employee workspaces, there's a point to which the accessibility ends. That's not to say that good design practice wouldn't maybe have you look into doing something like this to provide accessibility within those spaces, but sometimes it isn't practical nor possible based on the type of conditions, the assembly of space, the assembly, how it's being built. Some of it is obviously like pre-assembled product. We get into accessible parking and shortest possible accessible route from an accessible building. There are different ways to look at this, and I'm sure you all have had in one situation or another where the most accessible route is maybe not the most obvious. And these are the kinds of things with the HGA, and you may have a conversation about, well, this may be a shorter route, but it's not necessarily the most clear and direct as far as how the building is laid out. So it's important to have those conversations early. I can't stress enough, how if you're in the design development stage, this is a good time to start having that conversation, or even earlier with the building official, even to set up the game plan and say there are certain things that within the code that are you can be interpreted in slight different ways. And as long as you've got it documented and you can say we both agree that this is the route we're going to take based on how the code is being interpreted in this case, then you document it, and you should then at least have a good path to, making this requirement work in the construction documents and beyond. Accessible parking spaces. So this is the one thing that I didn't mention this, but I have had the opportunity as in the technical advisory groups. I've talked about this in the last couple sessions, but I was part of this group for the 1341, the last two code cycles. And one of the items that came up for that accessibility group, which was incorporated or part of our committee, was very specific for Minnesota. And it probably goes without saying, but it's about snow. And if you have accessible aisle, not only does it need to be striped, but on ironically, or maybe I don't know if it was intended, but the image that she picked here isn't actually correct, uh, especially in this case where a sign could be placed in the accessible route. That's the intention for that signage that I'm pointing back from. So there actually should be a sign here. Now that doesn't always work because of the nature of the parking condition, the sidewalk, the crosswalk. But when one is available, then that's what the group or the subgroup that within our committee was striving for, because there's too many times this doesn't get cleared out and people don't realize it, and then they end up parking here, and then these become basically very difficult to work with, especially if you have a van accessible spot and you need to have that access for your ramping. So that was an important thing that they wanted to make sure we had that in the provision specifically for Minnesota. It's just I'm talking about the existing parking spaces. You can certainly read through this. I won't elaborate on that too much. And then the accessible toilet rooms. Uh, that's always been a topic of conversation, uh, specifically because we're dealing with the gender neutral, which is in the provision now as far as science. We talked about that in the last code seminar. And Deanna has mentioned this, and I'm sure she'll mention this at the end as well, but these are all pre-recorded or recorded rather, and for your enjoyment, for future reference. So you'll be able to hear all of this again, of course, at your content, as you see fit to see things that have been talked about in the past as well as this session. So each toilet room and bathing room shall be accessible. So there are some provisions here now for the 5% and the ambulatory accessible. This was another provision that came up in the presentation or in our meetings, and that had more to do with the Margot Demke was the person that comes to mind from that group who was in our committee, and she was talking about someone who was paralyzed on one side, and wasn't necessarily in a wheelchair, maybe was in crutches, and felt that having just an accessible stall, and then only having ambulatory after the sixth one, which is what the main code ANSI A117 addresses wasn't necessarily enough. So she strongly recommended, suggested that we incorporate that into the second unit. So very important, keep that in mind as you're developing your spaces. And if you're doing remodeling, and just as we have done at HGA, if that space is part of your assembly, even though you're not doing the remodeling within that toilet room itself, there's a pecking order, the 20% rule. And that actually does require then that you bring that stall that may have been, it met code when it was developed, in this case, probably 5, 6 years ago. But now we would need to make that second stall ambulatory. So know that that is part of the provisions, part of the 20% rule may apply to you, especially in existing conditions when you're doing remodeling. Another item that came up that I wanted to emphasize here as well was having to do with the sink. You know, how does one address paper towel compartments, anything that might get in the way of the path of your clear, accessible space, the 30 by 40. Somebody mic'd off there. So what this is really important to, and I've talked to Karen about this too. Think about these spaces as the end of the path. In other words, not a corridor situation where they're talking about 4-inch clearance maximum off the wall during a path. Because it's at the end of the path, this should not be as much of a concern as far as, does it need to be 4 inches? Can it be greater than 4 inches? I just had this conversation with one of my colleagues here about that provision, how it's listed in their cut sheets. You could, in fact, put a paper towel dispenser on the side of the sink, which probably makes the most sense. But some people would look at this and say, well, it says you can't have any obstructions in your path. Well, if you put it over on the opposite side away from everything, it's not practical. And that wasn't necessarily the intent of what was going on here, because there are clearances that you can consider, that sink doesn't have to be necessarily right to the edge where it's like 30 inches, 15 inches from the center line of the sink to the wall. If it's beyond that, then the 4-inch rule, well, in this case, 4-inch rule may or may not be applicable. But the point is that you just need to maintain the 30 by 48. And she does bring up here as well, clear floor spaces can overlap sink clear floor space not required to be centered on the sink. So it can be an offset. Doesn't have to be directly centered on it, which then would give you some latitude as far as how your paper towel cabinets and so forth, dispensers are being placed. And note too that we don't have, it's not defined to be exactly 18 inches. There is a little bit of a wiggle room as far as your center line of your toilets are concerned, which is a good thing when we got into not necessarily planning for finishes. And it was a rough opening and it was set up at 18 inches. What happens when that finish came in? You may or may not have had a building inspector that took a tape measure on and said, you don't made 18 inches, you're at 17 and a half because that tile was in the way. Well, there is some latitude for that. And so you have this provision, and it can be a lifesaver, especially when things are all built out and finished up. Same thing with the paper towel dispensers. Got the same question about that. You know, is there anything in here that says what that depth has to be? Can it be more than 4 inches? And the answer is yes. According to Karen, conversation with Karen, there is no dimension that's dictating that it has to be within a certain depth. Now, from a design standpoint, you may not want to go overboard on this, but as far as what's happening below the grab bar, as long as your reaches are all being met, you should be fine with various types of paper towel dispensers or toilet dispenser. So know that there is that provision in there that gives you that latitude and some flexibility in how you design your space. There is that ambulatory compartment. This part really hasn't changed any at all. The only difference, of course, is that the ambulatory is not the sixth in a bank. It is the second. If you have two, you have your accessible toilet, and then you have your ambulatory toilet, and then, of course, any other standard toilets beyond that. So this is really just a cleanup, talking about private toilet rooms and what isn't applicable as far as accessibility is concerned. So it's giving you, basically saying you don't need to do it in a public office setting, as opposed to providing accessible toilets throughout a new construction. This would be exempt from that. So there's a lot of cross-referencing she's showing here. So certainly read that at your leisure. So I think we talked about this in the last cycle. If not, here it is. Minnesota single-user toilets cannot be assigned to a gender. So gender neutral, I believe, is the phrase, at least in this state. California may have another phrase, but these are the kinds of things that are being applied to our current code. And this is really just talking about grab bars for child height while water closet is not code required. Take a look at that, be aware of the slight nuances to go from an adult versus into a child height unit. So, and then talking about the placement of your labs, and this probably is common sense, but it really is saying if you're going to be creating this kind of environment where the lavatory is part of your accessible toilet, which it can be done, and I've seen it done. It makes it all in one spot, but then you still need to allow for at least 5%, but not less than one shall be accessible. But now it's saying an additional accessible lavatory would then have to be put out here. So it's not like you get the benefit of providing your one and then you call it good. Yes, you could, if in fact it's placed where it is, depending on where it is placed. So just heads up on that. And yep, it's just if you're getting into the call it the alternative sink design, you still have to meet those provisions for the height, the 34-inch height. So there's some new language in the accessible route for drinking and dining establishments. Just make a note of that on 1108.2.9. And really the comment here was not 5% of each type of space, but 5% of the space, which can have a factor depending on how you're designing your spaces. And we want to emphasize the 25% of the total combined area for dining and drinking for that provision for the accessible route. And the one thing that did change, this was more IBC, but this goes hand in hand with that when we were looking at the various committees, whether it was this last code cycle or the previous one in the 2015. we got away from the 3,000 square foot and basically based it on quantity. And I know that came up, something that Jerry Norman, who many of you are familiar with, who was at the state, now in Rochester, under their code uh, division. But that was something that came up constantly because people were always measuring based, but then it depended, what's the occupancy group? And obviously every occupancy group has a different factor, may have a different factor. So rather than trying to uh, focus on the square footage, just said 30 or less. And that then it wasn't based on the square footage anymore, it's based on the occupant load factor of the group that, or the use of that space that you were addressing. So that pretty much took care of that part of it. And then accessible service counters. So 1341 talks again about the public portion of the sales and service counters. And you know what your heights have to be, a height of 43 inches maximum above the floor for, oh, that's having to do with the vertical barrier between the service personnel and customers. Transparent security glazing, or maybe in the age that we're in now, COVID-19, uh, because I know we're going to be addressing those things. I know the vendors are out there talking to the specifiers about the things that they can do to address viruses, COVID-19, and other things that come into play. They're going to have a few more things to have to take into account that we hadn't in the past. But this gives you some criteria as far as what service counters require and don't require. And really having more to do, again, this is of the public use side versus the employee side. And so there are different provisions that one need to address to make sure that you have those accounted for. Uh, Nothing in the code about 6 foot yet, but who knows? I mean, at this point, that's not part of the play. But there again, we're all needing to work with our clients uh, and constituents to figure out what works best for the various uh, product project types and assemblies that are out there. But right now, this is what you have to work with. Same thing with service counters. It's really getting into the, this is not the scoping anymore. This is getting into the specific details, the technical information, as opposed to the first part of the accessibility code, which is really the scoping of it. And frankly, it's chapter 11 of the IBC. And then of course the ANSI portion of it is the second half of that code, or second half of that chapter rather. So there, I already mentioned this earlier. There is a 2017 version, but we're not taking that on. It wasn't, as Karen had said, it was looked at, but they didn't adopt it. So by not adopting it, it isn't applicable, at least in Minnesota. So know that you have the 2009 version to work with, which has been in our code cycle since at least 2015 Minnesota building codes. And it's really just talking about the services. She's showing some examples of heights and some good information here where it gives some graphic representation of what's possible, what's acceptable. So I kind of cruise through this one. So that is kind of what I have to offer. Obviously, this is kind of high level. It's some of it just like notes, not intended to be the answer all for every condition that's out there, but at least hopefully it gives this group a heads up of the things that have changed and some of the things that may not have changed but are still very much a part of the code and what we need to be cognizant of as we go through our design process. So if I go through and make sure if there's anyone has any comments. Or better yet, is it, can we just have people, if they have a question, open the mic?
Yep, and there are two questions in the chat box.
Okay.
So do you want me to read those to you?
Yeah, why don't you just read them to me
Okay.
rather than me trying to search for them here somewhere.
Yep, sure. So Brent Halverson has asked, has there been any clarification on the ambulatory stall? As I understand it, Minnesota accessibility requires 36 inches hold for width in the ambulatory stall and 32 inches clear width at the door. How have you seen this? How have you seen this practically applied? Usually this requires a 34-inch door with very minimal side clearance.
Yes. um, I'm trying to, because I do specifications, and I just, I'll be transparent about it. Since I do the specifications, I'm not necessarily getting, or I don't get involved in the CA portion of things to see how it all plays out in the end, unless someone from my group comes back to me and says, we just can't make this work, or we're getting a lot of pushback from the vendors saying it's not possible. So I guess I put that back on the group. What have you been finding uh, actually occurring within the shop phase? Are they even able to accommodate? I'm thinking there may be some very creative vendors out there who've been able to make that work. At this point, I'm not aware of any amendments that says that uh, we're going to give you some latitude. See, the thing is with the ambulatory stall, if you think of it, think of the ambulatory stall as not intended for someone in a wheelchair. It is intended for someone, say, on crutches, someone who actually is able to walk with assistance, but they're not utilizing a wheelchair, which is the whole idea with the 32-inch, right? That's the whole premise behind 32 inches, is so that somebody in a wheelchair can pass through a space. So if you think of it that way, and you maintain your 36, and you provide the maximum space for that door to get access to that space, and there is no other way to do it, I'm certain, well, not certain, but I'm hoping that the AHJ would take that into account. But if it's an ongoing problem for the vendors, for the manufacturers to even accommodate it, it wouldn't be the first time that code has dictated something and then the manufacturers have to scramble to get something figured out. Uh, that happened with the UL10B and 10C when it came to smoke rated doorways. Uh, that that kind of thing happens. But I'm not aware of, see, it doesn't, and according to this, it doesn't even dictate. So are you finding that it's actually stating that the door has to be 32 inches as a follow-up to your question? Because it definitely 36 clear is what they want to see. No more, no less.
So Brent, if you would like to unmute yourself and respond, that's fine. Otherwise, we can just move on to the next question. Okay.
Okay.
Are you ready for the next?
Yeah, go ahead.
Can you clarify the intent for the quantity of accessible lavatories in a toilet room if one is located within a stall? Is the intent that the minimum quantities in Table 2901 building code are met with all the required accessible ones being located in the common space? Or should one more fixture than what is required in T 2901 be provided?
Well, according to the presentation, to Karen's presentation, that's in fact what has to be done. You do need to provide the required sinks or labs, but if one of them, if your required lab is only found in the accessible toilet stall, then you need to provide an additional one that is for other use. So it's that has been clarified in the present. Sorry if I wasn't clear enough about that, but that is the intent. Is that if one is required and it's in the stall, then you need another one as well. So you actually are providing twice as many as required due to where it's placed. Hopefully that helps clarify that one.
Okay, there's several more comments here, so
Okay.
I'll just keep going.
Yep.
Cecilia Dillon asked, how is the code addressing the layout of shared lavatories for the male, female, and gender neutral stalls?
So I kind of addressed this. It didn't come up in this one, but in the 1305, the way that we are now looking at this next code cycle, prior to this, people were putting in sinks, labs in a public area outside of these toilet stalls, rooms, however you want to state these things. The code has now said, based on the UPC and I believe NFPA 101, it actually defined what a toilet facility is, even though the building code doesn't address it. And that's saying that it needs to be a sink and a toilet, not just a toilet. So prior to 2020, March 31st, folks were probably seeing that happen. And I know they were doing those designs even in our offices, where they were banking the sinks outside of the toilet spaces, rooms, whatever you want to call it. And in this code now, because of how it's defined, a toilet facility requires a sink and a toilet. You can't do that anymore. It has to be, so for gender neutral, whatever well, in this case, it'd be gender neutral, you have to incorporate the sink with the toilet. And I know in our building code knowledge community, we had lengthy conversations about that because we have folks who are also part of our building code uh, plan reviewer for the city of Minneapolis. And that comes up. And the way that we're addressing it is based on how other chapters or other codes are now defining these spaces. And that will then dictate that we aren't able to accommodate sinks outside of just the toilets themselves, as much as it makes some sense from a practical and space uh, efficiency standpoint. But there again, have that conversation with your building official and make sure that you're all on the same page, because there are situations, I know in K through 12, that's the way it always used to be. You'd have your Bradley systems where you'd have your sinks outside of your toilet spaces, and it was practical, but it was also a way for the teaching staff to monitor the kids, so you don't have things going on that you shouldn't be behind those spaces. And it monitored the fact that they could see that you were washing your hands. Uh, so there are some provisions that, according to the code now, as I understand it, that wouldn't be acceptable. However, I qualify that by saying, check with your building official, check with your AHJ to make sure that, I'm not speaking out of turn here, but to know that your group occupancy is or is not able to accommodate the new provisions. Uh, but like in a business occupancy or other public spaces, yes, it's in fact not possible anymore to separate the two. They need to be paired up.
Okay, thank you. So John Papke asked, in the bottom right figure on page 10, noting 27 inches max dimension to the underside of the projecting counter, should this be a minimum dimension?
Well, John, that's probably come up before. um, that yeah, there are criteria within the I'm just looking at the book itself. Obstructed high forward reach. It's talking about that's talking about reach. There is something, if you go look at 306 figure 306.3 knee clearance, it does talk about 27-inch minimum. So you have 27-inch minimum, but you have a 34-inch maximum. So do the math, and you know that you get what you get. You get your 7 inches of wiggle room to work within. And then there's a zone. There's an 8-inch zone. Doesn't say, well, at 27 inches, it's 8-inch minimum. And then it goes up to 11-inch minimum uh, for a 9-inch minimum height at finished floor. So there's a zone. Take a look at that figure 306.3A elevation, and that hopefully will give more clarification to your question.
Cool. Another question. Peter Hill has asked, as outdoor ramps are disallowed, am I excused from an accessible route and or type B units in converting an existing residential building with 2 steps or more up to the doors?
Huh. That's a that's a conversation you better have with your building official, because you're docking. It sounds like you said existing building code, but that sends you back to 1341. Now, if you're talking about something that's historical, you may or may not have some latitude in that, but always think of it. I know code is minimum, right? Code is minimum. So best design practice always should be taken into consideration when you can. Find a solution that is going to be accommodating. Type Bs are not going to be as restrictive or specific as a type A or an accessible, as I understand them. But I would definitely take a closer look at that to make sure that the accommodations are there based on the type of unit. And I'm not as up to date on multi-housing. It's not something we do a lot of at HGA. So in my previous life, yes, it was more of my focus. So I don't want to misspeak or give some inaccurate information, but it sounds like you've got something that needs to be considered. But without seeing a diagram or getting into the detail of it, definitely warrants having a conversation with an AHJ, because just keep in mind, accessibility code, as we know it, it's Title III, but it's still the law, meaning somebody could still come back even though you have this code to look at, and they can still come back and say, I don't think this meets ADA, and I think this needs to be changed. And your due diligence is to obviously work within the realms of this code, but never assume that it's the end all, uh, because accessibility is still needs to be addressed when someone makes a case for it, and that that's a high bar to have to try to figure out sometimes, is what does that mean. But at least you have a starting point. But if you're trying to work around something just because it, the solution is not feasible, that's one thing. And going back to something that Karen had mentioned, uh, go back to that for one of those first slides, and talks about if it's feasible. So if it's not feasible and there's another solution somewhere else, then you might have some way to work around that. Um, but know that there are going to be maximum extent feasible to provide accommodation. So it depends.
Got it. Not really. I don't have it at all, but I'm sure everybody else does. Um, so we've got 5 minutes left,
Yeah.
and there's several comments, I believe, that are all relating back to Brent's first question.
Okay.
Um, one person says, in my experience, this has been a challenge for toilet partition vendors to accommodate.
Okay.
Another person has said, we've specified 1-inch HM frames with 34-inch door in ambulatory stalls.
Okay. And it apparently works. But there again, and please correct me if I'm wrong, because I'm not, as much as I like to think I have a pretty good handle on all the things that are out here. There are so many variables that come into play. I'm not aware that it actually states that you need to maintain a certain width. I mean, and it's the 32 makes sense if in fact it was an accessible stall, because you have a wheelchair going through it. But that's not the intent of these ambulatory stalls. Uh, in my understanding of it, it is, as we discussed in our tag committee, uh, for those that are not in a wheelchair but still need the assistance of grab bars, and putting on both sides, because maybe you're paralyzed on the left side and you're trying to come in from the right side. So you want to have the capability of accommodating someone in that situation. But so it sounds like, if I'm hearing right, it's possible. I mean,
Yep.
it's a 1 inch. It's a very narrow, flimsy, potentially condition, and hopefully it's not a ceiling hung unit, because that's even going to be more challenging. I'm assuming these are floor mounted overhead brace conditions, where at least you have some way of anchoring it, getting a better anchoring system, because obviously there's only so much you can get from a system, and the narrower it gets, the harder it becomes to achieve that.
And somebody, I think, is trying to clarify the question. He said a 32-inch door does not allow for a 32-inch clearance due to the thickness of the door. I think Brent was asking, a 34-inch door needs to be provided in order to provide 32-inch clear access into the stall. And how has that been achieved given 36 inches is required? And then he references back to Casey Nyes, I believe is how she pronounced her name,
Okay.
who says we've specified 1-inch HM frames with 34-inch door in ambulatory stalls.
Okay. And I assume you're getting it. I mean, it's one thing to specify it, right?
Mm.
It's another thing for the vendor to actually give you what you're specified if they can't accommodate it.
And
Um,
then there is another comment that says the toilet compartment vendors have made this work in my recent experience.
okay.
And then,
So for everyone out there, it's possible.
Scott Anderson says,
Ah,
I
Scott.
disagree. with the statement about allowing door clearance reduction. Several mobility devices beyond wheelchairs require the 32-inch clearance.
Are you saying for ambulatory, Scott, or are you saying for accessible? Because I'm not referring to accessible stalls. I was just specifically talking about ambulatory stalls, where it's may or may not be physically possible. It sounds like it is. And certainly I'm not trying to suggest that we should reduce the 32-inch because it's a number. And a lot of things in code, if you go to these seminars, they'll say, well, you know, how'd you come up with this number? Well, we picked a number and we stuck with it. And is there anything magic about it? Not necessarily, but it's a number, and it's a number that gets continuously repeated in various parts of the code. 32 inches is one of them. So if you can make it work, then certainly I would say I applaud you to do so, right? Because the better to be making it possible for most people to be able to be accommodated with an ambulatory stall, certainly. But yeah, for accessibility, no, accessible stalls, I'm saying you gotta meet the clearances that are there for the reason that you're using a wheelchair that needs access to that space, whatever that space may be.
So I think with that, we'll conclude this session. Any final words, Gerhard?
I just wanted to thank everyone for attending, and hopefully this is helpful for you in some way or another. You get some little bit of nugget, some takeaway from it. Um, on behalf of our building code knowledge community, we typically take a break, but because of COVID-19 and because of things like this, which Deanna has asked me to chime in on, and because of the nature of what's going on at Department of Labor and Industry right now, uh, we will be starting up again in September. So we meet on the second Wednesday of September. Probably going to be virtual. I would assume so.
It will
Jana?
be. It will
Yep.
be. Yep. I think that AIA Minnesota has decided to have all of our meetings virtual through the end of the year.
Okay.
Yep.
And for those of you that haven't heard yet, we're doing virtual for the state convention as
Yeah,
well.
that's right.
So, and three Wednesdays in October.
That's right. Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
So stay tuned for that.
Yeah.
It's a new normal out there. Who knows how long this new normal will last, or it will become its own animal. We'll see, I guess, in
Indeed.
the grand scheme of things, how that
Yep.
all plays out. But otherwise, yeah, join us in September, second Wednesday of September. We'll be here uh, zooming away from 12 to 1, and we try to provide either just a informal forum where you bring your code questions, and then we can certainly kind of tackle those as a group,